So I want to talk about a really interesting decision that has just been handed down. It's the matter of Game Meats Company Australia and Farm Transparency International, or FTI. So what happened in this case is Game Meats operated, and still does, an abattoir in Victoria, and they operate on private premises. FTI is an animal advocacy group, and what happened is members of that group trespassed upon Game Meats' private property, installed some covert cameras and obtained about 14 minutes of footage which depicted the abattoir operations. Now, the question before the court was whether it was appropriate to make an injunction against FTI, so restricting them from publishing the footage that they obtained whilst they were trespassing upon the property. But also, and what I think is more interesting, is what's to be done with the copyright that vests in that footage that was taken. Because what Game Meats was applying for was an order that the copyright in that footage be held on a constructive trust in favour of Game Meats, which is quite unusual.
Yeah, very much so. So at first instance, the court found that the copyright was held and maintained by FTI, but on appeal, it actually granted the injunctions, but determined that the copyright was held on a constructive trust for and on behalf of Game Meats. And that's quite an interesting development and reflects a bit of a departure from pre-existing authorities. So in effect, without any kind of contractual obligation, assignment or similar, Game Meats owns the copyright in that footage and the ability to adapt it, produce it, change it, or in its case, not use it whatsoever.
Which is likely going to be the scenario. I don't expect that Game Meats is going to publish the footage itself. It's really unusual, and it's really unusual in cases where there was no pre-existing relationship here to have this order to transfer the copyright in that footage. What the court considered was the nature of the conduct itself, and found that the conduct wasn't in good conscience, and essentially that it would be unfair for the trespasser, FTI in this situation, to profit from its intentional violation of Game Meats' rights.
Quite evidently, FTI was looking to embark upon a public shaming campaign, okay, and the court has effectively stopped that. Now, I find it an interesting avenue that Game Meats took, and ultimately was successful, but it's quite apparent that this option of pursuing them and seeking declarations that the copyright was held on a constructive trust, and then an injunction that ultimately required that FTI take steps to transfer all the footage and then ultimately delete any record it maintained of that footage, was interesting because, I mean, obviously here where there was an intent to cause harm and public shaming of Game Meats, Game Meats wouldn't have had available to it your kind of more conventional types of causes of action. For instance, I mean, quite clearly defamation would not have been a viable cause of action, or anything else like misleading and deceptive conduct, because I mean, we can only speculate that the footage reflected, actual operations, and so those aren't claims that would have been available to it. But it was able to actually stop the ongoing dissemination and publication of that footage through this means of saying, well, no, that copyright is held on a constructive trust by us, and thereby we are the only ones that can use, disseminate, adapt, etc. with respect to that footage, and thereby effectively stop the harm and damage that was ensuing to Game Meats.
Absolutely, and you're right, intention was really important here to the court's decision. So the court distinguished what happened in this case to prior cases where there wasn't this intention to inflict economic harm. That was really important. The court looked at the fact that FTI had obtained this footage with the strict intention, or at least an intention, to inflict economic and reputational harm against Game Meats, as opposed to purely journalistic or investigative purposes. So it's a fine distinction, but it was made in this case. I mean, I think it's going to be interesting to see what other courts and other judges do with this distinction which is being drawn. I mean, can you separate out the investigative purposes from maybe a secondary intention to create some reputational or commercial harm? It'll be interesting. I think it's going to be a complex area of law that will develop following this case.
Yeah, and personally I find it rather interesting because, I mean, the intent of FDI in this instance was something that the court deliberated on and made determinations about. Whereas when you look at the strict provisions of the Copyright Act, it actually doesn't really introduce the notion of the specific intention, the surreptitious obtaining and creation of, copyrighted materials, so that footage in this instance. And so the intention of FDI in this instance is a particularly curious element of the judgment.
Absolutely. I think another really interesting question that arises in this decision is how do we deal with the issue of moral rights? So the right of attribution that attaches on the creators or the co-creators of this footage. Those rights aren't ordinarily transferable as copyright is, and as FDI was ordered to transfer in this case. So how do we deal with that ongoing tension between the moral rights and the copyrights departing, resting with each different individuals? I think it's going to be a really interesting line of case law, which we can expect to follow from this judgment.
Without a doubt. And so we just should also remember what moral rights are. So they're the personal non-economic benefits or rights that attach to that material, whereas the copyright is usually more concerned with the economic rights and ability to commercialise that material where needed and appropriate.
Absolutely. I think what this case will do, undoubtedly, is really raise questions for individuals who do obtain this type of footage, whether that's publishers, advocacy groups. It really calls into question whether it's worth it to take the risk to obtain footage potentially by trespassing upon private premises if what is going to happen is they're going to be restricted from publishing in the first instance, but also then directed by a court to transfer their copyright to the very company that they are seeking to expose or uncover in the footage.
It's a fascinating decision for journalists, whistleblowers, activist groups, and I think it's a real lesson about ensuring that any footage or images or other information in which there is copyright is treated with caution, and that parties are actually taking abundant precautions to ensure that it isn't going to be material that's been taken surreptitiously or without authority, or instances such as this, through trespass, because it might be that they are faced with an injunction application and ultimately injunction restraining that use.
Absolutely. It'll be interesting to see whether the strategies, the operations to obtain this footage will change following this judgment.
Yeah.